Hello there. This is just a quick video on the methodological considerations that you may wish to consider for your own method section when writing up your written report assessment for the Level 5 Sport and Exercise Biomechanics module. So a couple of things to mention before we dive in. First and foremost, this is one of the least engaging PowerPoints I've ever made, but it's hard to make this topic, it's hard to jazz it up, let's say, so my apologies there, but hopefully it will be one of the most valuable to you. Secondly, this is just a guide. This is not an exhaustive list there, and this will, some elements may or may not apply to you. I've used an example throughout. If your study is different in any way, then you need to correct it for your study. Secondly, whilst I've presented the subheadings in the order that I would present them, the topics that I would include I've simply written down as bullet points in the order that they came to my head. So you may wish to rearrange some of these, and I'll point out a couple of examples as you go. Finally, almost, it goes without saying, but it did happen once before, this is not meant to represent, or the following is not meant to represent how you present your method section, i.e. as a series of bullet points. It's a series of written paragraphs that explain exactly what your experimental procedures were. I'm sure you already knew that, but just to be on the safe side. So let's dive in. As I said, the first thing you want to do is divide your methodology up into subheadings, and these vary. The method section is the most diverse section between research articles because every study is different. So this is just an example. So if you've used human participants, then you may wish to start with a participants, or you might want to call it subjects. Doesn't matter, I'm not precious about either. Subheading. So in this, you want to include information such as the number of participants that took part in your study. So n equals, I don't know, 10, let's say. And if you had a mixed gender population or sample population, then you may wish to acknowledge or you will need to acknowledge the number of males and females. If you want to save on your word count, then you can just acknowledge one of the genders. So, for example, if you were to say 10 participants took part in this study, 5 of which were female, you can leave it there. We could do the math to work out how many are male. Again, not essential, but just trying to save you a few words in your report. You will also want to acknowledge how your sample population was gathered. In your case, it was a convenient sample, and where the sampling took place and came from. Of course, you are university students. You don't need to say, oh, university students from University of Suffolk on the whatever degree, and da-da-da. Just university students, and participants were collected via convenient sampling, which, as we have discussed before, I believe, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but it's basically like grabbing the nearest person that you can, that you think will be good for your study, and asking them if they'll take part. So very little randomization there, but does get things done quicker. You'll then perhaps wish to acknowledge the training experience of your athletes, and this will vary depending on whether you did the barefoot shod project or the resistance training project, or if you've some other project that you've done as part of this assessment. So most of us will be recreational level athletes. Some of you may well be higher than that, but most of us it will just be a hobby or something we just do for fun, and you can sum that up by saying recreational athletes. If any of you are higher than that, so are, I don't know, county or professional level athletes, then that warrants acknowledging. You'll need to include some participant anthropometrics and their age, so the average age of the cohort, their height, their mass, with the units of measure, so years, meters and kilograms respectively. Remember, that's mass, not weight. In biomechanics, that's a little bugbear of mine, because weight is a force and mass is not a force, and that's on others. If you were using the stadiometer in the lab, you were collecting your mass. So there we are. This will also be presented with the standard deviations of each of these measurements. So the average age, let's say, I don't know, 22.5 years plus or minus, I don't know, 7 would be the standard deviation. It's just an example. If your participants completed any health questionnaires or any forms of any kind before giving consent, this will need to be acknowledged, and the fact that your participants gave consent. Now, as university students, you don't have to give written informed consent, but you can say that your participants gave oral consent to take part in this study. A PARQ form is a physical activity readiness questionnaire form, so if you completed that, or if your participants completed one of those, then that will need to be acknowledged before you mention that they gave consent. And finally, you may wish to acknowledge that your participants were made aware of any potential benefits and risks of their participation, and also that they could leave the experiment, leave the study at any time without giving a reason, because that's what we do. Okay, so that is the participants subheading. As I say, not the most rock and roll PowerPoint, but there we are. The next one, again, you could use various titles for this: study design, experimental procedures. Again, I'm not precious, I'm really not. But in the previous subheading, you've described the sample population that you used, and in this section, you're explaining what they did. Some studies, you'll see, will break this up into two sections, so study design and another subheading that discusses that labels out the equipment that was used. So you could think of that as what they did and how it was done, if that makes sense. But that's not essential for yours. If you do it, it's fine, but I would recommend just making this one subheading. Again, just trying to save on your word count. So any study design or experimental procedures section needs to acknowledge the type of experiment that you performed. So just an example, a repeated measures crossover design. So participants completed a repeated measures crossover design they took place on the same day, so they're exposed to both experimental procedures, so let's say barefoot shod, or I don't know, straight bar or hex bar deadlift, or high bar or low bar squat, whatever it was you did. And as it was the same day, you'll want to acknowledge how long of a rest period they got in between. This doesn't need to be overly specific. If it's just 10 minutes, 5 minutes, or you could even just say a suitable period of rest was given between testing periods, so that's fine. The outcome measures is, for my money, the most overlooked part of the method section that is very often absent when we come to mark these, and it's essential because outcome measures is simply you saying, what did you actually measure? What was it you were testing? And again, this will vary study to study, but you've got kinematic and kinetic data, and you will need to acknowledge this. So what were you looking for? So if you had, let's say, your participants running over a force plate, you've got that force plate data. What did you then measure? Was it the peak vertical ground reaction force, or medial lateral, or anterior posterior? Was it the peak ground reaction force at a certain period in time, so at initial contact or mid stance or at toe off? This, you really need to be specific here. If you're looking at your kinematic data, what exactly, you can say you measured, I don't know, hip, knee and ankle flexion, but was this peak hip, knee and ankle flexion? Was this the joint position at a specific moment in time? This needs to be very clearly stated in this subheading. You may or may not, this one may or may not be relevant, but you should all be aware of our lovely, very clean, very frequently washed clothing that we have. If some of you brought your own to wear, I certainly don't blame you, but you need to acknowledge that your participants wore some sort of non-reflective clothing when completing the experimental procedures, because typically in biomechanics we try wherever we can to apply our markers to skin, but in your case we will have got you to either bring your own or delve into the box of clothing that we already have. So just a brief mention here, this doesn't need to be overly detailed. Okay, this is just an example, do bear this in mind. So if you've collected kinematic data and placed markers on your participants, retro-reflective markers, by the way, that's important to understand the terminology there, that's what we refer to them as, retro-reflective markers. You need to list the anatomical locations that the markers were placed on, and this is where you need to get your anatomy right. You can't just say, so acromion process, shoulder, greater trochanter, hip, knee, ankle, toesies. Toesies is not what we want to see in a report at this level. You need to say fifth metatarsal head, lateral malleolus, lateral femoral epicondyle, greater trochanter, acromion process, wherever. This is just an example, as I say, but yours may very well be different, but you need to get the anatomical terminology correct. It doesn't take much, just grab an anatomy textbook or look it up online. It's worth mentioning that the markers were attached by the same student researcher or researchers. If you were trying to get your study published, then you'd want as few researchers applying the markers as possible. Generally, it's just one, because this reduces variability. One person might be better at doing it than another. So, oh, whoops, wrong way. You will also need to acknowledge that the equipment that you used, so again, just an example, but here we've got anthropometric data was collected using a Saker stadiometer, Saker, Hamburg, Germany, or you could just put Saker, Germany, that's absolutely fine. So you're acknowledging the equipment that you've used to collect the data and just briefly stating where it's from. If you're unsure, quick Google search will help you find this information. It doesn't take long. I forget off the top of my head where the 2D Quintic cameras come from. I know it's a UK company. Can't quite remember where, but it doesn't take much. It's 5 seconds Google search, you'll be fine. So whatever data you've collected, be it participant data view, participant information, or for your outcome measures, you need to acknowledge what you used to collect it, and briefly in brackets where it was made. Depending on the type of study that you've done, you may wish to acknowledge that your participants had a sufficient period of familiarization. So for example, if you did the resistance training project, and you've got people that are completely naive to resistance training, you may have given them a period where they could just practice lifting, I don't know, a hex bar, or performing deadlift, or performing a straight bar deadlift, before data collection was completed. So if of course we should all be vaguely familiar with running, but are we all familiar with barefoot running? I haven't done it in a long time, so I'd probably need a familiarization period. So you may wish to acknowledge that. If one was performed, if you didn't, that's okay, but if you did, you need to acknowledge it. Oh, there we go. Quintic Birmingham. There we are. Quintic cameras from Birmingham. Look at me remembering things. You will also want to acknowledge the biomechanical parameters. Think back to level 4 that you collected. So, plane of motion, axis of rotation, all those things we discussed way back in week 1, the fundamentals of how to describe movement, they need to be in here somewhere. Just briefly, you don't have to go into great detail, but if you looked at the sagittal plane, then that needs to be acknowledged. You will also want to include in this section, which I've just realised I didn't mention, how the equipment was set up. So your camera might have been positioned at a certain distance from your participants, and things like that. Again, you don't need to go in immense detail here, but the thing to remember when writing up a methodology is there enough information in here for someone else who isn't familiar with my study to read this and replicate it perfectly? They will be in a different lab to you, obviously, so you don't need to say things like, oh, they stood on the east plate or the west plate, because that's not going to mean anything to anyone else. But you need to write it with that in mind. Could someone read this and replicate my study exactly as we performed it? Obviously they wouldn't have the same participants, but their study design would be the same. If you can do that, then you've got yourself a good method section. Finally, this is a brief one, data analysis, or statistical analysis, you may wish to call this subheading. Your raw data was assessed using the Quintic Biomechanics software version 31. That might have changed by the time you watch this video. Maybe it's 32, 33, or who knows what, but you just need to check. You then will want to acknowledge the software that you use to perform your statistical tests, and the type of test or tests that you use. Did you do a normality test beforehand? What was the result of that, and what statistical test did you then use, and what is your p-value set at? Your alpha, that will for the majority of you be 0.05. And that is pretty much it. So hopefully this has been useful for you. As I say, it's not an exhaustive list, it's just something I thought you might find useful when writing up this section. And any queries, as always, do drop me a bell. I'll get back to you as soon as possible.